Hello and welcome back. We are finally here at Chapter 3, aka the part of our course where sentence diagramming begins in earnest. As I'm sure you have noticed from your reading, our textbook authors divide the sentence patterns up into 10 separate patterns, and we are going to tackle patterns 1 through 3, the be verbs, in this lesson. Let's dive right in. It's all been building up to this. Pretty exciting. It might be useful to recall the two parts of a sentence before we get going. The sentence formula, as you'll recall, noun phrase plus verb phrase equals sentence. If we have a noun phrase and a verb phrase, we are on our way to sentence town. We might also think of these two components, noun phrase and verb phrase, as two slots in a sentence. Every sentence has two slots at least, the subject slot and the verb slot. Every sentence is only going to have one slot on the subject side of things. What goes in that slot? The subject. The subject goes in the subject slot. There's not a lot of variation on that score, but every pattern is going to have any number of different things that go in the predicate slot or slots. The predicating verb is going to be one of 4 verb types: be, linking, transitive, and intransitive. And there will be other stuff that follows as well: subject complement, direct object, indirect object. So we might really think of these 10 sentence patterns less as whole subject patterns and more as predicate patterns. The predicate is the thing that's changing. Let's think about how these diagrams are actually going to work. In its essence, every sentence diagram is going to break down into this image. We have the subject on one side in the subject slot. We have the predicate on the other. They're both resting on what we call the main line. And the main line is divided, it's bisected, by a vertical line to give us one side for the subject and one side for the predicate. The line that separates them bisects. That's the essence of all sentence diagrams. We can also talk a little bit about prepositional phrases here before we dive right in to our actual sentence patterns. You'll recall from Chapter 2 that a prepositional phrase could be either adverbial or adjectival in function. If it is in fact an adjectival prepositional phrase, remember we diagram it under the noun it's modifying. If it's an adverbial prepositional phrase, we diagram it underneath the verb it's modifying. And we'll do it on this little L-shaped thingamajig that sits underneath the main line. The preposition goes on the diagonal line, and the object of the preposition goes on the horizontal line connected to the diagonal. Sort of an L-shaped thingy is about as precise as I can get with it. Now we're ready to actually talk about the be patterns, patterns 1 through 3. We group these into a set of 3 because they really are a set of sentence patterns. It's a set of patterns with 3 distinct patterns within it. And anytime we're talking about the predicating verb as a form of be, these are the only 3 patterns it can follow, right? It can only have an adverb of time or place, that's pattern 1, an adjective that describes the subject, that's pattern 2, or a noun phrase that has the same referent as the subject, that is pattern 3. You have to have the be verb for it to be patterns 1 through 3. And then you're only going to have one of those three things following it. There's one glaring exception. The shortest sentence possible in the English language, I am. Okay, there's nothing following the be verb there, and it's still a complete sentence. There are lots of relatives of this sentence too. You are, they are, he is, she is, it is, and also it was, he was, she was, etc. They were. These are simply affirming something's existence, right? They are grammatical sentences, they are complete sentences, they are using be verbs, but they're not following one of our 3 patterns. They are exceptions to the be verb patterns. Let's talk about pattern 1. Pattern 1 is a noun phrase in the subject slot, a be verb in the predicating verb slot, and an adverb of time or place following that be verb. That's what we mean by ADV/TP. Adverb of time or place. It's required. It has to be there. It's a required adverbial as opposed to, we'll learn later, an optional adverbial. It could certainly be an actual adverb designating place or time. Now, downstairs, here. But it could also be an adverbial, something that fills the role of an adverb, and a whole lot of the time that adverbial will be a prepositional phrase, adverbial prepositional phrase. Sometimes it will be a noun phrase functioning adverbially, but we'll talk about that in Chapter 6. Don't worry about it at all right now. The patterns are going to look two different ways. If it's pattern 1 with an actual adverb, the diagram will look like this. We have our noun phrase in the subject slot, the main line bisected, the be verb in the predicating verb slot, and the adverb on a diagonal line. This is the template. We could also have pattern 1 with an adverbial prepositional phrase, and it would look like this. The noun phrase in the subject slot, the be verb in the predicating verb slot, and then our prepositional phrase, adverbial prepositional phrase required, hanging out on that L-shaped thingy underneath the main line. I've prepared a few sentences for you in pattern 1 for practice. The first one, the students are downstairs. You'll notice I have separated the subject, the predicating verb, and the required adverb of time or place. Then I've done form on them. So the students in form is a noun phrase. The verb is a be verb, and downstairs is an adverb. That's what they are in form. And then, what are they doing? What is their function? Well, the noun phrase, the students, is the subject. The be verb is our predicating verb. And downstairs, our adverb, that's a required adverb of time or place. When you are doing these sentences, you don't just want to diagram them. You also want to do form and function. Here are several other sentences that you can use for practice. In fact, I will be asking you to diagram these and do form and function as part of your required homework. Let's move on to pattern 2. Pattern 2 is a noun phrase, a be verb, and then an adjective of some kind. The thing that's different is that this time we have an adjective following our verb. What's the adjective describing? Well, the subject, of course. It's describing the subject. And since it describes the subject, we call the slot this adjective goes in the subject complement slot. Of course, we could also have a noun phrase in the subject complement slot, and that's the case in pattern 3 coming right up. There are two ways to fill the subject complement slot in pattern 2. An adjective, or adjectival, more on this coming up in chapter 7, or, and this one is a little sneaky, an idiomatic expression, like a prepositional phrase, that is still describing the subject. So this can be a little sneaky, because we have to decide if we see a prepositional phrase following our be verb, is it a prepositional phrase talking about time or place? Is it adverbial? Or is it a prepositional phrase functioning idiomatically to describe the subject? If you can replace it with another adjective, you're definitely dealing with pattern 2. For example, if I said the cat is over the hedge, I can't replace over the hedge with some adjective. I can't do that. It is in fact an adverbial of time or place. It's pattern 1. The cat is literally over the hedge. First is the phrase, the production is over the top. I'm not saying the production is literally over the top of something. I'm saying it's lavish. I'm saying it's extravagant. I'm using an idiomatic prepositional phrase as an adjective, pattern 2. There are two different ways then that these patterns can look when we diagram them. Pattern 2 with an actual adjective is going to look like this. The biggest thing to notice here is that the be verb is separated from the subject complement by a diagonal line that doesn't bisect the main line. It stops right there on the main line. And it's slanting toward the thing it's modifying, aka the subject. So the subject complement's line is slanting towards the subject. Our diagram will look like this also if we're dealing with a prepositional phrase instead of an actual adjective. We're still going to have that slanty line. But don't freak out. The idiomatic prepositional phrase is going to go up on a pedestal because prepositional phrases go on pedestals when they fill complement slots. I know this is a little wacky. It is a little unusual to see, but we will practice it quite a bit. So if it's a prepositional phrase in pattern 2, pop it up on the pedestal. Once again, I've prepared some sentences for practice for you. Form and function. The students are diligent. In form, students, noun phrase, are is a be verb, diligent is an adjective. In function, students is the subject, are is our predicating verb, and diligent is the subject complement. You will try these in your homework as well, diagrams and form and function. Finally, pattern 3. Pattern 3, which is slightly less complicated because we only have to worry about one version of the diagram, which is going to be really nice for us. Here we have a noun phrase, a be verb, and another noun phrase. The big difference here is that the subject complement slot is filled by a different thing. Pattern 2, it's an adjectival, but pattern 3, the subject complement slot is filled by another noun phrase, another NP. Since it's the subject complement, which is to say it is referring back to the subject, actually the noun phrase in the subject complement phrase, in the subject complement slot is talking about the same thing as the NP in the subject slot. They have the same referent. They're referring back to the same thing. And since they're talking about the same thing, we call each of them NP1 instead of just NP. We're showing that they have a relationship to each other. They're talking about the same referent. This is going to be different than in some later patterns. Stay tuned. Luckily for us, there's really only one pattern in form that we're going to see here for the diagram. Noun phrase 1, be verb, noun phrase 1. You'll notice that, once again, the subject complement line is slanting back towards the subject, the thing the subject complement is modifying. And I've prepared a few more sentences for practice. The students are scholars. In form, we have noun phrase 1, we have our be verb, and then guess what? We have noun phrase 1 again. In function, the subject, the predicating verb, and the subject complement. Here are a few more sentences for you to try form and function and diagrams for in practice. And practice is really important here. Practice makes perfect. It is going to take a little while to get these diagrams down, so you need to practice, practice, practice. We'll do a lot of it in class, but you have to work on it on your own in order to master it. Cassidy says, even though it's complicated, she has every confidence you can master these diagrams if you practice. So keep up the hard work, and we will see you next time.